following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
So I see it as being, kind of a core piece of really any DApp that has a need for historical information, which is essentially everyone needs data, and that's what we provide, and that's why the graph is just in an incredibly great position for Web3.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Derek with DataNexus and GraphGod, both of whom are curators at the Graph. I'm speaking with Derek and GraphGod to learn more about their work as curators and to introduce Curation Station, a stakeholder community within the Graph entirely dedicated to curation. My conversation with Derek and GraphGod covers their entry into crypto, how and why they got involved with the Graph, what Curation Station is and their long-term vision for it, and their early experience working as curators when Curation launched back in July. We began by discussing their professional and educational background, starting with GraphGod.
Sure. So I've been a software developer for about 10 years. And during my time as a software developer, it's mostly been related to creating and maintaining databases and delivery of that information to, another service, whether that's a front end of a website, or that could be a third-party CMS system or something along those lines, all delivered via API. So that's a pretty good background to immediately notice the value of a open source API market, which is effectively what the Graph was. So I had a friend of mine that got me involved with crypto during DeFi summer. I had been a interested observer, I guess you'd say, before that. But once I saw the Graph, I realized, that is going to eventually replace my job. I'm a back-end Web 2 software engineer, and I'm just thinking to myself, boy, I better learn this if I want to be, or at least buy it if I can't learn it. So I bought some, and then I just was so enthusiastic and excited and about what Graph's going to be. So I ended up creating a Twitter, and I just started talking to everybody about it, and then you guys know the rest, Curation came around, and, now we have the Curation Station.
Yeah, my background's somewhat similar. I used to work at a software developer boot camp. I actually worked in their sales area, and so I had to learn the lingo of speaking, tech speak. And shortly after that, while I was working there, I was doing the program in addition to that. And then when my wife and I moved across the country, I decided I would try to get a job as a developer. And so I'm now a database developer, and I've grown to be the senior SQL developer for my company. And I also do a lot of their database administration work. So with how I got into the Graph, I was mining Bitcoin back in 2014, purely on the basis that one of my friends said, "Hey, do you want to cover your electricity bill by running your computer?" And I was like, sure. So I mined, probably about 8 Bitcoin, but I was just selling it each month to pay for my electricity bill. And then with, hardware upgrades and all that stuff, my mining rig was no longer profitable. So we shut that down. And then in 2016, when Ethereum was listed on Coinbase, I got an email from them saying like, oh yeah, we've got a new cryptocurrency that we're offering. So I bought decent amount of Ethereum, and I got bit by the Ethereum bug pretty quickly because it was, it offered the ability to build things on top of it and provide more value than just just the store of value that Bitcoin offers. My only drawback to that is I never really had a way to participate in the network, because at that point in time, I hadn't done much development work yet. And so when there was a Coinbase Learn and Earn program where they said that this protocol indexes the Ethereum blockchain. And as a database developer, I'm like, oh, this indexes the blockchain? That's something that I know things about. Let me see if this is a way that I can contribute to a network and grow a network and improve its value. That way I can, from a more causative point of view, improve my holdings and improve what I'm doing, because I have that active role.
Well, I'm really intrigued to be talking to two people who have such a strong background on the software engineer and development side, maybe in a way that would be helpful to listeners of the podcast that are non-technical. What is it that guys like you see in the graph that makes it so valuable and you are so optimistic about this project?
Yeah, so the thing that really excites me about this is, from my work as a database developer, I'm constantly working with tables of information and all of that. And I've seen good databases and I've seen poor databases. And if you look at what a subgraph is, and I know that you asked this question on the podcast of what is a subgraph, from a non-technical user, we've all used Excel. And if you were to envision an Excel spreadsheet where you're trying to keep track of your banking records, or you're trying to keep track of, event attendees or whatever you're keeping track of, you want to make sure that your data is in alignment. So the first column has your name or the first name of each attendee. The second column has, whatever specific information you're looking for. And what can happen is if you throw all of your Excel spreadsheets into one spreadsheet, then you have data mismatching. So your second column might be the funds that you received if you're doing a banking spreadsheet, or if you're doing event attendees, it might be what chair someone's sitting in. And that as a data structure is not something that is very usable. So when I considered what the Ethereum blockchain looks like in terms of its transactions, it's largely set up in that way where it's almost like a mismatching Excel spreadsheet, and there's no good way to get information that you really want. So querying anything, against the entirety of the blockchain is just inefficient, because you're not only querying your spreadsheet, but you're querying everyone's spreadsheet and having to sift through everything. So when I saw that the graph was a way of taking the data from the blockchain that's specific to what you intend to use it for, and instead you just query that subsection, that to me made a lot of sense. And that's why I got really excited for it, is because it's a very efficient way of utilizing the data stored in the blockchain.
What gets me excited about the graph is Web3. So, if you think about a traditional website, you go to a URL, you pull up a website, usually that's written in JavaScript, and you get, you can think about for example, the sushi analytics page. You have all this information that has to exist and be available quickly to show you things like total value locked over time, or the price of the coin over time, and something like that. I think that down the line, a lot of websites are going to end up running on the blockchain solely, like, through Filecoin and Fleek and ENS and all these services. You're starting to see the building blocks of Web3 all sort of get lined up, and I think we're very close to some sort of a next step of web, like how AOL was, 20 years ago. Everyone, all of a sudden, we were all on the internet. And I think that, we'll see something similar. But it's possible that, I don't know exactly the extent of what it'll look like in particular, whether customers will know that their Facebook website is running on Web3 or not. But when you think about what's coming, the entirety of like the internet now living on some blockchain doesn't even need to be Ethereum necessarily. All of these sites are going to need access to data efficiently. And, you see a lot of people talking on Twitter about, I'll just spin up my own node, or my own Ethereum node. I don't need the graph, but you do, because like Derek said, you do need, this isn't just running your own node. This is a set of instructions. A subgraph is a set of instructions that tell you exactly what data you need that is, important to you. And it puts that all in one place for you. So it's easy access. All of these sites are going to need that API, that data. And I don't think that people would prefer to run their own systems in place, their own nodes, in order to get access to it. So every website, every Web3 website will need it. The next Facebook, the next Twitter will need data access, and the graph will provide it, cheaper and faster than you could get it on your own. That's what makes me excited.
Well, GraphGod, I would regret not asking a follow-up. And of course, Derek, I'd like to invite you to answer this as well. But how will listeners experience the benefit or the improvement of a Web3 environment, right? I think we're so used to Web2. Everybody knows how in the day-to-day the internet impacts their lives. But what's the step up? What's the benefit of a Web3 world?
Sure. So to be honest with you, there are many advantages to having this Web3 internet, right? So you can see Stani Kulachov from Aave talking about, well, you should own your data. And for people that are privacy focused, there's a lot of reasons why you should be ultimately in control of that. But, personally, I think that the biggest improvement is going to be for dApps, because, traditional companies, like a Facebook app, I think that it will eventually be less expensive to host your website or your app or whatever on the blockchain than it would be to pay someone like Amazon, especially as more of the world gets internet access. I mean, there's still plenty of places in Africa and throughout the world that just don't have good internet. And there's a lot of people that live there. So as the internet increases, we're going to need data centers in Africa, in Europe, in America. And all of that is very expensive. I mean, I don't know exactly how much Facebook is paying for, hardware, but I've worked at some, relatively large businesses and have some sense of what we spent per month. It was easily in the six figures. And I could see, larger companies spending much more than that. So I think that the big benefit that I think will get a lot of people to move over will just simply be that it's cheaper to use, the blockchain as the back end for your website, because you'll have, speedy response times and cheap service anywhere in the world that data needs to be served. Now, with that said, there's a lot of other, end user pluses, but I think for me personally, that's where I think we'll see the adoption is from the big businesses. You'll see Twitter swap to the blockchain, and other, maybe Facebook or other services, just simply because it'll be less expensive to run their platform.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I would also add that there's, especially with a graph, you have decentralized network of indexers. So if one indexer goes down, you already have another 150 that are ready to take its place. So there's a certain security or a certain high availability benefit that can be had when you're spreading work across multiple people. And it just removes a single point of failure. So for large companies like Facebook or Chase Bank, for example, if they have one data warehouse that goes down, they've got plenty of them, and they've already had to solve that problem, and it costs them a lot of money to do so. If you're a smaller company or you're a smaller application, you might not have as many disaster recovery resources available to where you're just relying on your one sole server. Well, now with a graph, the fact that you have multiple indexers that can be hosting your subgraph, one of their machines goes down, or there's a weather event or a hurricane or something that disrupts their hardware, you probably won't even notice. And so that's a huge benefit to the smaller players in the world. But in terms of what would Web3 look like, I would say there's going to be a point where you don't even realize that you're using Web3 anymore. But there's a coordination level and certain functions that are now available on a website, especially with a payment layer. You look at some of the things that Radical is doing with being able to coordinate on code with projects. You can pretty easily integrate payment on projects all from within the website, have it be instantaneous and permissionless, which is something that Web 2 just simply doesn't have the capabilities of doing. So that as a function, being able to work, provide value, and provide a product and receive instant payment for it without having to, go through other hoops is immensely valuable.
Well, Derek and Graph God, the reason we're speaking is because you guys have teamed up and you're working on this thing called Curation Station, and I want to learn a lot more about that. Before we dive into some of the details about Curation Station and what you're doing within the Graph community, I think it'd be interesting to know, did you both get involved in the Graph with the intention of one day becoming curators there? Was that the initial draw? Maybe start with you, Derek.
Sure. So I found out about the Graph just through the Coinbase Learn and Earn. It talked about indexing the Ethereum blockchain. I already had a lot of affinity for Ethereum and how it worked, but I never learned Solidity, so I didn't feel like I could participate in it. But I was trying to, when I saw that this was indexing the blockchain, I was like, okay, I know that there's a way that I can participate in this network and provide value to it and, kind of make my mark in Web3. And so I reached out to Pranav on Twitter because I saw him post that, he just started with the Graph team. And then I also messaged Yaniv on Twitter and I said, hey, I'm a SQL developer and database administrator. What would be the proper role for me in the Graph? Is it indexing? I did read up on curation, but I didn't fully understand it at first. And the first thing that was pointed out to me was that I should start studying subgraph development and that I would be a great curator if I was, good at analyzing data sets and stuff like that. So I started watching some of the different testnet videos on curation, and I was, all eager to go, but I didn't yet know that it hadn't been released yet. So I did all of this study to figure out, okay, how do I be a really good curator? And then I found out that it wasn't yet ready. Well, that was about a week before the launch of the mainnet. And so it worked out perfectly to where a week later it was ready. So I said, perfect, I'm ready to jump in. So I started developing my first subgraph, and I didn't get much past that because Curation launched. And then, since then it's been a rocket ride.
How about for you, Graph God? Did you begin with the intent of becoming a curator?
Actually, no. I got involved with it with the intention of becoming an indexer. When I first heard about Graph was around the time it launched on Coinbase in December. And I went to their website and I was looking around and I saw the delegation thing and I was like, well, that's cool. And I put my coins there and I was like, what else can we do? And I read about indexing and I thought, gee, I'm not exactly a DevOps pro. I mean, I can certainly do it. And it sounds like, that's the biggest skill that you'd need for that, except also having 100,000 Graph tokens. So I says, well, that's my goal. I'm going to get 100,000 Graph tokens so I can become an indexer. And so I don't know how long exactly it took, but eventually I got to 100,000 coins and I thought, okay, well now I have these coins, so I got to start learning this indexing thing. And I just got lazy. I guess at that point I was like, gee, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I should do this, so I kind of sat on that for a while and I thought, like, I knew I wanted to do it, but I wanted to do it a little differently, I guess is what I should say, because I saw that there was a lot of other indexers that had like 17 million tokens and everything. And I thought, gee, how am I going to compete with that? So I got a little apathetic and lazy at that point. And I started thinking, gee, maybe I should learn Solidity so that I can build some kind of index together tool. So my thought was, hey, I'm just one guy with 100,000, but, if we could do this like delegation and put it, so I started thinking about how we could like work together to make a indexer team, like a decentralized one. So I downloaded some training stuff and went on YouTube and was trying to learn Solidity. And then around the time where I actually started putting in the work, Curation, well, maybe I had been putting it in for a little bit, but at that time Curation came out and I thought, gee, this is great. I spend all this time on Twitter, so I should know everything, right? I know about all the projects and everything that's going on. And, so I got involved with Curation on the first day. And even though I would like to come back to that index together tool or protocol that I had an idea for, which I do intend to work on at some point next year. This will do for sure for now.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. In past episodes of the podcast, we've learned that one way delegators help to secure the network at the Graph is by staking GRT with indexers. The network is designed to look at how delegators stake their GRT to identify trustworthy and reliable indexers. In a very similar way, podcast directories look to the reviews and ratings of listeners like you as a way to gauge the trustworthiness and reliability of podcasts. If every listener of this episode took 5 minutes to leave a review and rate the podcast, that directory would rank the GRTIQ podcast higher in search results, making it easier for community members and those seeking more information about the Graph to find it. Thanks for supporting this project.
Thank you for your support.
Roger that.
An important question, of course, would be to describe what a curator is and how it fits into the Graph ecosystem. And so, what is a curator and what is the nature of their work and why is it so important?
So as a curator, what we do is we quote unquote stake our GRT, which we call signaling. So we signal our GRT to a subgraph as opposed to how delegators stake their GRT to an indexer. And so what that signal does is it provides an indication for indexers to go and sync that information. That way, queries can start to be serviced on the information that's being indexed. So an important aspect of this is that this controls the knob of how indexer rewards are allocated to different subgraphs. So if we provide a lot of signal to subgraph A, then that's going to have more indexer rewards that get split amongst the indexers based off of how much they individually stake on subgraph A. So since we control this knob, there's a couple of really important aspects, or I would say a couple value points that we provide to the protocol. And the first of which is that we help balance the overall reward systems for indexers. They earn query fees, but right now they're very heavy on the indexer rewards. And we, promote or we reward the indexers that are taking actions on important sets of information. So by signaling more to a subgraph, that helps ensure that it has more indexer support and more indexer resource, which ensures further uptime for that subgraph, and they have better geographical positions, because if you have 20 indexers that are spread all throughout the world and the end user is located somewhere, chances are they'll be closer to an indexer if there's 20 of them than if there's only one of them. So that's a key aspect just in terms of where subgraphs are at currently based off of their historical information. Now, that could all be done by a computer, just looking at based off of historical information. This is how many query fees exist, et cetera. But really, the human interaction is what makes the curator leg of the network so valuable. So our job as curators is also to utilize our information to predict market movements. And this is why people who are on social media, play a really important role, because they're keeping in tune with, different partnerships that are happening, new features that dApps are providing. That type of thing is important because we can't expect our indexers to try to stay abreast of the entire blockchain network. We currently have 150 subgraphs on the mainnet. I don't know that anyone could name what every specific subgraph does. And so being able to predict what's happening with these things, is really important. And lastly, in a permissionless system, anyone can post any subgraph. So there's a certain aspect of looking at how do we get new subgraphs supported. And really the way to do that is through curation. right now we have 150 subgraphs. So that's fairly simple to do. But if you look at the hosted network, we have 20, 30 subgraphs posted every single day. And that's only growing at this point. And so as our mainnet starts to support more networks, then we're going to see more and more subgraphs posted on the mainnet. Now, when 30 subgraphs are posted each day, we can't expect our indexers to go through all 30 of those and understand what it's doing, what type of traffic it's going to have, and figure out which one that they want to sync. Instead, that's our job. We get the opportunity to dig into each of those, reach out to the different teams and really get a sense of what that subgraph is doing. And from there, we then signal the indexers to come pick it up. So in a world where there's 10,000 subgraphs and a new one is posted, who's to say that it's going to get support? Well, curators are. And so that's I would say a really important aspect of what we do.
Well, as listeners of the podcast know, the work in the curation community is definitely getting noticed by the indexers. And in fact, in a recent interview with Gary Morris and Jim Cousins, I think they were referring to the work that the Curation Station is doing within the graph community and kind of being on the front end of everything that's happening since Curation's gone live. And so what's the story behind Curation Station? What is it for those that haven't even heard of it?
Sure. So Curation Station is a Telegram and Discord group that is all about graph curation. Curation is complex. It's not something that you can just go to a website, click a couple buttons and be done. And even for me, who has been involved with the graph since the Coinbase listing in December, it was even challenging for me to handle on my own. So the story of the Curation Station is that Graph Protocol released, mainnet and curation, and now, people could, finally do every little job that will exist for now, at least on the Graph Protocol. So when Curation launched, all of a sudden, all of these subgraphs were coming onto the mainnet, and you could go onto the site and you could see, wow, Aave has a subgraph on, the mainnet. And who else was it? Ethereum Name Service and USDC Coin and all these projects. And I'm thinking to myself, this is insane. The share prices are so low. So I just started buying everything because why would I not? It's so inexpensive, like what I thought it should be signaled to. Now, of course, at that time, I didn't know a few things. Number one, that they were not legitimate. And number two, that I really didn't know how to, at that time, properly value a subgraph. But I just thought, this is an Aave subgraph with, say, 70,000 tokens. That's less, that's not really that much money in this scheme. So I just decided to buy. And after I bought everything, and I was tweeting about it like crazy, like every 5 minutes. I'm like, guys, you got to get into this thing. I'm typing as fast as I can. There's so much money to be made. Like, just buy this, and I'm getting all excited and I'm riling people up. And I know, like, I had people DMing me like, how do I do it? Like, real quick so I can get in. And it was just this mad dash to subgraphs. And then, I started poking around because I was like, all right, let's, take a look at their site and see, how they're getting information out of the graph, or, where these GitHub links that are in the subgraph description go. And I started to look at everything and I thought, I'm starting to think that maybe these are not legitimate, but it would have been far easier to notice one or two illegitimate subgraphs. It was far more difficult to realize that literally everything I was looking at was fake, with the exception of course, the first 8 or 10 subgraphs that were launched, with, right? So I sort of was talking this out live on Twitter to no one in particular, just like, I'm starting to think this is not legitimate. I'm just going to sell everything. Maybe I'll miss the boat here, but I just need to take a second and, really see what I'm even buying here. And then it hit me that, and I wasn't even sure I was right 100%, but it hit me. I don't think any of these new subgraphs are legitimate. And then so I started posting on Twitter saying, hey, look, guys, you got to really exercise caution because, it's hard to tell in some cases that these are not legitimate subgraphs. And it was around that time that I got a tweet from Tegan. And she said, that she agrees, like, everyone should do their own research and it's hard. And she said that people that are interested should join forces with other curators to build a tribe. That's what she called it. She called it a tribe. So I was thinking that almost as soon as she made that tweet, I was like, yeah, I'm a part of the Graftronauts, and so I know that there are, communities for user communities for the graph, and of course they do a great job, but theirs is more of a general buy and hold group. They talk about delegation for the most part. And I thought, gee, I can make a Telegram group and I can invite, and I thought maybe I'd get, 10 or 20 people. I didn't expect anything major, but I thought, hey, maybe if I can convince 10 or 20 people that got into this. And I felt bad too, because I actually made money when that happened with all those fake subgraphs. I sold out when I wasn't quite sure if things were real or not. And then I started tweeting about it. And I don't think I'm that influential, but it wasn't too far after I started tweeting that, a lot of these started getting dumped pretty heavy. And I felt horrible because I knew I probably convinced some people to jump in and they lost money. So I thought, this will be a great way for us all to learn together and to help people. And we can do this as a community. I thought, I have my skills, other people will have theirs. And so that's grown quite a bit. So we've gone from a couple of people. Of course, we had some, people that were really contributing and standing out like Derek. So we actually didn't know each other before the graph and curation. But once I made the Curation Station, so many people joined. It was more than one person could handle by far. And I was spending considerable time on the Telegram and Discord channels at first. I think the first week I was more or less AWOL at my job, just sitting at the house like, oh boy, let's talk about curation and everything, and that was probably not very responsible, but that's what I did. So there were some people that would stand out. Someone would say, hey, we should ask on the project's Discord, if some new subgraph comes out, whether it's legitimate or not. And so we didn't want everyone to bombard their Discord. So we'd say, let's have one person in charge of it. And I think actually that was Derek that had done that sort of wrangling and saying like, yeah, we need to manage this properly. Let's have one person talk. And I kept looking at the Telegram channel. I kept seeing Derek talking, more or less doing admin stuff anyway. And I was like, well, gee, all right, well, why don't I just, give him admin status so he can actually have some, whatever authority you get from being an admin of the Curation Station. I don't know. But anyway, so I made him an administrator, and he's been easily at least half of the Curation Station as far as, running things ever since. And there's, of course, been some serious, people that have really stepped above and beyond to help out. So there's, obviously don't know everyone's name. One of the folks is XOOOOOOO from Telegram and Discord. He's helped significantly in building the GG bot that we have that runs there. There's also Flintropolis from the Discord who runs the equivalent bot on the disk, because, the GG bot only runs on Telegram. The old software that I used for it only had built-in Telegram capability. So I says, all right, well, I'll get around to Discord. And by that time, Flynn had already built that bot. So I thought I won't step on his toes. He can have that. So Jonah got involved and he built the prototype for the curation dashboard. And so we all kind of got together and said, hey, there's been some feature requests for GGBot that really just don't make sense a Telegram bot to do, and really would be much better off on a website. And we had been talking about maybe building something, getting something together. And so many people offered to help. It was awesome. But it looks like early next year, we'll have a whole curation dashboard. You'll have, charts and how much you could make if the subgraph goes to a certain level of signal, and, just all kinds of information. So that's sort of the background of the Curation Station, where we are now and where we're going soon.
So, Derek, is one way to think about Curation Station is Graftronauts is to delegators as Curation Station is to curators?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that they're pretty similar, but ours is, obviously more curation related. Kind of a little backstory on how I got into the Curation Station was largely due to the, permissionless nature of the graph, which is a feature, not a bug. And with that feature, anyone can operate within it. And it is a trustless system. And so anyone can post a subgraph, whether that's from the, project themselves, or if they forked that code off of GitHub and posted it. And so pretty quickly when we realized, okay, some of these, have intended use, some of them do not have intended use, whether it was published with malicious intent or because they're just a third-party dApp that wants to use it and they're a little bit smaller, it's important to understand what the subgraph is doing, what its intended use is. And that was something that I picked up pretty quickly. And I saw other curators jumping in and signaling on things where I was like, hey, this person has not only created the Uniswap subgraph, but they also created 2 other dApps. Like, I don't think that this is coming from Uniswap. And so as that was progressing along, I started, I almost feel like I was barking orders at people at times, but there was a little bit of the confusion, people running around like chickens with their head cut off. And so I wanted to get some structure in place to say, when a new subgraph is posted, here are the steps that you can take to verify, is this something that has intended use by the dApp that it's indexing? Or, just understanding what is it indexing? And so I quickly realized that this is not something that any one person can do. And that's, for me, why I joined the Curation Station and why I tend to stay pretty active is the network as a whole benefits if we all understand more. We can provide smarter signal to the subgraphs, and that will then provide smarter signal for the indexers, which that makes our leg of the network stronger. That makes the indexer leg of the network stronger. That helps delegators, which keeps delegators happy and grows the strength of the token, and all in all, the whole network's operating better. So from that vantage point, I was like, okay, we need to have a place where we can coordinate. But also I knew that, and like GraphGod mentioned earlier, if we had all, however many thousand curators jumping into other dApps, Discords and Telegrams and, spamming them saying, hey, is this your subgraph? That would be a turnoff to most people. How many phone calls do we get about, your extended car warranty? I didn't want the graph to turn into that because we are a very professional service and we provide a great product for Web3. So I wanted to maintain that. And, I work as a community member, but as someone who's in the role in the community, that's something that we have to keep in mind. So I wanted to put some structure into place so that someone already had a relationship built with a developer for a project. They could just be the person for that. And, we could all kind of funnel our communication through that person. And so, yes, to answer your question, it largely is like Graftronauts, but for curation. There isn't necessarily an intended structure. There's just there's a little bit of structure that came into place out of necessity of just understanding the subgraphs that are posted on the mainnet.
Well, in both of your answers, you hit on what I think is really the crux of the issue related to curation for anyone that's interested either in participating as a curator or just understanding this part of the network. And it's when you talked about, these non-legitimate subgraphs that arrived really early on. And before I ask you the question of what are some of the things you guys learned on the front lines as curation went live, I want to ask 2 questions related to the fundamental nature of curation. The first one is, like you said, GraphGod, how to properly value a subgraph. That's pretty loaded because I know there's a bonding curve and things like that. But how would you describe, GraphGod, this idea of how to properly value a subgraph?
Sure. So it's a big question that you really have to hit a lot of points to really answer. So I suppose the first thing would be to determine whether or not the subgraph is legitimate. And I think having watched the community grow and how we validate and verify, one of the most effective tools is something that, Derek has been a big part of, and that's simply asking that community, usually via their Discord, hey, is this legitimate? Now, the problem that we've noticed with that is that, you don't always get a response right away. So then it becomes, well, do we take the risk and signal to try to be early and get the the bonding curve boost, or do we wait and be sure? And in the early days, waiting and being sure basically cost you a good spot, because you either, if it was legitimate by the time we had confirmation, a subgraph, most of the early days, the subgraphs were already signaled to 100K by the time we could confirm or deny whether or not that was an appropriate signal. I don't know why in people's headspace that we came to this 100K number, but it sure seemed like a lot of subgraphs were running up to that number, and then we would just sort of wait to see whether it was legitimate, and then it would go from there. So that actually prompted the creation of ggBot. So I'm a back-end software engineer. I work in Web 2 mostly. So, I noticed, and I can't talk about how we validate and verify, and the ggBot creates a score. So you might have a validation verification score of anywhere from 1 to 10 or higher, but it's a weird scoring system. But basically, the way it works out is if it's a 10 or higher, it's probably legit, at least as far as what we can tell by looking at the subgraph. So I can't talk about the specifics so much, just because if I do, some of the scammers may say, okay, well, I'll just, make sure I do all these certain things right. But there's a lot of things that, not legitimate subgraphs will do that we can check for, that the community has decided. The bot will also look at the Ethereum address that deployed the subgraph to see what kind of transactions that they've made. Typically, some of the things I will talk about at least a little bit. So one example might be a Ethereum address was created, funded from Binance, and then published a subgraph. Almost any time you see a subgraph published in that way, it's not legitimate. But you can't always tell, and it's not 100%. But if you look at some, like the Badger subgraph, I can talk to specifically. If you look at the address that published the Badger subgraph, you'll see that it was funded, somewhat recently before the subgraph was published. As far as transaction count, recently, that could be a year before or whatever, but it was within the last couple of transactions, was funded by the Badger Treasury. So you could look at the Ethereum address and say, well, they got money from the Badger Treasury, so unless this is a hacker, it's probably legitimate. And you'd think some hacker capable of busting into Badger DAO might, find better uses for his time and money. So that one was pretty quick to say, all right, well, and that's some of the things that the ggBot will look at. But the intention was to, anything that, we could automate away. So we could focus our human talent on things that humans are better at. That was sort of the idea. So, of course, nothing that I write is going to be 100% perfect. It may say that a subgraph is legitimate or illegitimate, and it's the other, whatever. But it's how I could contribute most effectively, quickly. Plus, going back to the Graftronauts comparison, they had a cool Telegram bot. So obviously, the Curation Station needed a cool Telegram bot with reputation and that sort of stuff, which was the first function.
Yeah, and to add to that, there's the first aspect, which is figuring out if a subgraph has official support or if it has intended use by the DApp that it's indexing. And then the second part is figuring out what is the expected use, and what would be a proper or fair amount of signal to place on a subgraph. So a really key point to know is that depending on how much you do or don't signal, that's going to determine how much indexer rewards are allocated to a subgraph and then split amongst the indexer sync. So your signal is very important, and it's not good for us to over signal on a subgraph that's not going to have as much use, just like it's not good for us to under signal something that is going to have a lot of use and deserves more indexer support. How exactly that's determined is something that the free market's still somewhat determining. From a very mathematical point of view, you could look at what your intended return is on your signal, how many shares you're going to get. Based off of the number of shares that you're going to get, what percentage of that is, how much is that in percent compared to the total shares? and then look at that query fees it's been receiving and whether you expect the project to grow, and how fast you expect it to grow. And then you have to make an estimation of where you expect the query fees to be in the future. And this future concept, something that's really important to curators, is because this is where our value comes into the indexers in addition to helping Subgraph's bootstrap, is signaling to the indexers when we're expecting that a project is going to grow. And so that's where a lot of curators come into play with our, how we're doing on social media and keeping in tune with different projects and understanding where things are at. But these are some of the kind of core concepts of how to evaluate total signal. But I would say that our leg of the network is intentionally very query fee driven. And so that we have to look at what volume a subgraph is going to produce in terms of queries, and not only the number of queries, but also the complexity of queries, because tougher queries to service may warrant a higher query fee. So something might have higher query fees, even though it has slightly less traffic. Those are the types of things that we need to be looking at, is what's going to drive more volume to the network and thus strengthen the network compared to where it's at. And that will determine whether or not your shares will appreciate with the query fees proportionally speaking.
This is all very interesting information, very helpful to try to understand, all the early work and these two really critical ideas. So could you, Graph God, maybe give us an example or a conceptual idea of how one might go about valuing a subgraph?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take an example subgraph. Let's say that the GRT IQ podcast made their own subgraph because they're selling their podcasts now, your podcasts, as NFTs, and you need a website to run all that. So you create your website and you want your data from your smart contracts. So you create a subgraph. So we've got the GRT IQ subgraph, right? And let's say that your website gets, has how we usually look is we'll look at Alexa ranking to try to decide how many, unique visitors per month your website might have. So let's say, for example, that we look up GRT IQ and you have Alexa ranking of 5,000. So you're this super popular website. And of course, this is all just estimation and guesswork, to be clear. But let's say that you have, we figure you have 1 million unique visitors per month. Okay. And on the homepage of your site, you may have 3 queries that run to the graph mainnet, your subgraph. And so based on that, if you say, okay, you have 1 million unique visitors per month, let's assume that each one of your unique visitors goes to your homepage one time, loads it, and then says, all right, I'm out of here. And they close the page, right? So a low ball estimation of what your visitors may do. So that means that per month, your subgraph would receive approximately 3 million requests. Okay. Now, if we assume that those 3 million requests are all coming in at the average cost per query. Now, the average cost per query is 0.0001 GRT per request. To be clear, that's not dollars. The cost, the hardware that costs money to serve this information, all that is in dollars, but the query cost itself is in GRT, which is something that even I did not know right away. So it's worth mentioning, right? So let's say, okay, that means that you got 3 million queries per month at 0.0001 GRT per query. Your subgraph is generating approximately 300 GRT per month in query fees. Now, if you break that out to a year, that's 3,600. So if you have 3,600 GRT, per year that this would generate, but keeping in mind that, Curation only receives 10% of the total query fees. So if you had a subgraph that was signaled with 100,000 GRT and it's only making 360 GRT a year, keeping in mind that Curation only receives 10% of the total query fees, you would have percentage of query fees versus total signal at about 0.36%, which would tell you that, hey, this is actually pretty well over signaled and you might consider selling things off. So, you have to look at this in the context of delegation rewards being at around 10% or so per year. So, there's definitely some value in curating versus delegating, being that you are able to buy and sell right away. Whereas with delegation, you are locked up for a 28-day thaw period. So there's some value that's going to be priced in there. So you might consider an 8% or 7% being the threshold rather than a 10%, since you can sell right away. But to see a subgraph that's signaled to the point where it's only receiving 0.36% would be something that, it is way over signaled and way overvalued in comparison to what you might earn as a delegator.
Hi, this is Derek, or DataNexus and Graph God with the Curation Station. We are curators at the Graph. If our conversation with GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Podcast.
Thanks for listening.
So outside of these two really important concepts that you both just so brilliantly described, that of the, illegitimacy of some of the early subgraphs that were deployed and the learning curve associated with that, along with this idea of how to properly value a subgraph, I would love to hear both of you just talk a little bit about what are other lessons you learned or other things that you saw that might be helpful for members of the community to know.
The value of, just having good communication skills. I mean, I've talked to probably 30 different developers from different projects since we launched the mainnet. And that's, I'm now working on a subgraph with a project that they don't have a subgraph on our hosted network yet. So I'm working with them on building their subgraph, which has been, very exciting for me. But just having good communication skills with the people that you're working with, because in our network, we want to really maintain our professionalism, as a service. I've found that I've been able to get in touch with people pretty easily because, I don't market at them, but I talk to them and try to help them resolve their issues. It's not only new to us, but it's also new to other developers. And so, being a helpful community member to make sure that they can publish their project and not run into bugs or issues, or they tend to have questions, things like that. In terms of, specifically the frontline day one type of stuff, we learned pretty quickly some of the different things that you can do to verify the subgraph, which we've touched on quite a bit. And that's been really important. But then also, I would say another thing that I picked up is just kind of the community feel around the graph community. And that's one of the things that really has kept me here, is because, if you look at other blockchain projects, you get kind of this hype driven, diamond hands type of mentality, which is not what we're about. We're about providing legitimate value and servicing other projects to make sure that they succeed. And when you're really value driven, it makes this project an easy one to buy into, and it makes it a lot more fun to interact with the people here, because they tend to be people who are, very intelligent people, and it's just something that I've really enjoyed being a part of.
I think I've learned two things from, having been involved with curation, and specifically the Curation Station. One is just the total amount of skills that come in handy to help validate and try to evaluate the value of a subgraph. You'd think, I'm sure most people would think, well, you should need to be some kind of a coder or something. And if you're not a coder, then you have no idea what's going on. But, if you're like a marketing person, or if you're like some kind, there's just so many different skills that come in and are valuable within the community. Because a marketer or an SEO person or something like that might be able to look at a site and say, oh, I know how much traffic that site probably gets every month, and that is incredibly valuable to figure out, because you can take, unique visitors to a site and then load up their homepage and see how many requests to the graph service get made, per page load. And that's something that I'm sure a marketer or some SEO person could do. It's fairly simple, a few clicks, and right away you would know. And if you're, a software engineer or a networking person, or just any person involved with technology, even a little bit, those skills that you have will be valuable. If you're a communications person, You might get involved with the Curation Station and help to reach out to different dApps and see if, they need help with their subgraph, or if there's someone that you could get them in touch with to help them out. So that's been amazing to me, number one. And that ties into the second thing I've learned, which is just the power of people. I'm constantly surprised by the people within the Curation Station and what the level of information that they give away for free solely with the intention of helping others. It's just amazing, So you'll have people that say, hey, I'm involved with this project, and they're saying that they're going to release their subgraph tomorrow. So get ready to make some money, everybody. So everyone in the Curation Station will be like, wow, that's, and so we'll look at it and we'll say, all right, well, is it worth buying? And, and people will jump in and it just, nothing replaces having, I don't know if the subscriber, I think we've got about 300 people in the group, somewhere around that at this point. The value of having 300 people in the group is just amazing. There's so many helpful folks that spend a lot of time giving away information for free in the group. And that's really emblematic of the crypto community as a whole. We're all in this, together. And it really shows.
So given what you know about curation, obviously you guys know a lot about indexing and delegation as well. Who would be the best member of the community to try their hand at becoming a curator?
Yeah, so the different qualities or things that I would recommend someone have, if they're looking into curation, or I guess a better way to say that is, the people who would do best as a curator in the role of the network are the people who intend to, take a really active participation in the network, that maybe don't know DevOps as well to run their own indexing node, but someone who is able to keep on the pulse of blockchain. People who use social media. That social media in itself is a huge advantage in the curation network if you're seeing when things are happening. People who understand information and look at a subgraph and understand, okay, how is this being used? What information is it indexing? Who's going to want to plug into this information? That's another very valuable skill. But all in all, I would say people who want to have a really active role in how the network's operating, that tends to be really good for curators.
So after the launch of Curation and services went live, you guys were obviously out there doing a lot of early work, which is really cool, kind of pioneers in the curation space. The next big thing that happened, I think, from my perspective, was this rabbit hole campaign, which seemed to bring a lot of curators, at least on this campaign, into the space. So what was your experience of that?
Yeah, so that was right around the time where I first started recording videos. And I have some videos on YouTube on some of the early steps of curation and how to learn on how to become a curator. And so with the rabbit hole campaign that was run, I had people reaching out to me in Discord saying, hey, I just watched your video. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And I constantly have people reaching out to me, which I'm all for. My lines are all open. And so when that first happened, I had a bunch of people reaching out to me and I was like, oh, okay. So now I'm a person in this community. Okay, here we go, type of thing. And so, that was exciting for me, but it was very cool to see the new people coming in and figuring out, okay, how does this work? Because curation by nature, it's not something that it's not incredibly simple. Like it takes a little bit of study to really understand. And so I recommend to people, as you're first getting started, take your time and figure out how it works. Make sure that you understand the different mechanics before you do things. And then, you get taken advantage of because you don't understand. Much better to understand before you take action. And that's another value that the Curation Station has, is we constantly have people asking questions about how certain things work. And, a lot of us are, either non-technical or newer to the network, where we're all kind of learning together and we can share our knowledge and help people get up to pace really quickly.
I think that the graph wins via horizontal scaling, meaning that it's not so important if you have a Uniswap or a SushiSwap or a Aave on the graph. I think that how you win is to have 100,000, 1 million, 10 million different services of any size on the platform. And, if that's how you think the graph wins, then, you would think that you'd need at least a couple of curators per dApp to really have the people bandwidth, I guess you'd say, to like really evaluate all of these projects and try to come up with a appropriate signal. So I know we're early now and we have kind of a smaller relative to say delegator or just holder count of curators, but I think that curation almost requires just a ton of individual curators. So I'm not sure how many websites are on the internet, but I would say, maybe around that many folks that should be curating. Maybe twice or three times that number, somewhere in there. And I honestly believe that the curation market will eventually support that level of involvement. Right now, we've got, last I looked, about 170 or so subgraphs on the market. And, the last I looked, I think we have 1,000 curators. So, those numbers, I guess, make sense right now, given the number of subgraphs we have. But I think, as time progresses and more folks, more projects get involved and create subgraphs and put those on the main net, that we'll see that curator count, climb over time. But going back to what Derek said about, it's not hype. This project isn't about hype. So you don't have 100,000 curators all jumping in and doing stuff right now, because it's about making a product work and getting this, a system figured out. And then from there, maybe we'll see some marketing. So I think that, there's nothing wrong with a slow burn up. And I think that's more or less where we're at now. And this is something we haven't talked about yet, but and this is mostly Derek. When I talk about him being 50%, he's at least 50% of this. There's several. Let's say there's one or more GIPs that are in process right now to improve the curation process. So we're still we haven't even still landed on the perfect curation flow, right? So I think as things are hammered out and as we get more subgraphs, we'll see the curation count grow.
Well, Derek, I want to talk a little bit about what GraphGod referenced there, which is improving the flow of curation. And you've worked on a couple GIPs that specifically address this. What can you tell us about what you've proposed there and where we're at in that process?
Yeah, so with the different GIPs that we have rolling, I get really excited about it because I love the concept of creating a better playing field for everyone to operate off on. Making the user experience easier, making it, well balanced so that we are incentivized for good work, all that type of stuff. And so those are the things that I've been working on. And it's not just me. There's a handful of curators that really understand the protocol and, how blockchains interact, what things can be done, what things can't be done. And so we're working on resolving some of the problems to better the playing field for everyone. So that's something that's exciting to me. Two of them that are moving forward that are nearly completed. I was on a phone call with Edge and Node, and some of the code work on the deploy and signal function is, that code has been completed. It still needs to be audited and then needs to go for a vote, but it's something that has pretty large support so that when a new subgraph is posted, within the same transaction of publishing the subgraph, the publisher has the ability to signal on that subgraph. Which if a subgraph developer who's doing all the work on the project, or if it's coming from the project themselves, they kind of deserve the chance to be the first on the bonding curve for their subgraph. So that's something that just makes sense. Also, that helps put a shield up against any bots that might be trying to signal, on the first position. Part of the way that the bots behave is that they are expecting to receive a certain amount of shares by taking the first position. And if they don't get that amount, then their transaction fails. So that's something that will help human curators do a better job and really reward those curators who are doing their job at verifying and inspecting a subgraph and making sure that it's something that deserves support. So deploying Signal, that's something that I'm super excited for. The next one that's coming or should be coming shortly is also the change of ownership. Which I'm excited for more on my DataNexus side, because DataNexus is an LLC, and I started to work with another DApp that is working on getting their mainnet posted, and they needed help with their subgraph, and they don't have one that's on the hosted network yet. They're just going to go straight to the mainnet, and so I'm working with them, and I intend to be the person that publishes their subgraph, And then once it's published, I will change ownership over to them. So for people that are within the ecosystem that are Subgraph developers and are doing so as kind of freelance work or something that they're not necessarily part of one specific DApp, it's a great way for them to obtain work and have a chance to curate on their Subgraph, and then pass that off to the DApp so that they can make upgrades to it whenever applicable. Beyond that, there's a couple of, I would say, slightly larger changes that are going to be focused more on addressing, how do you properly initialize a subgraph and make sure that the early stages have proper incentives compared to, staying in a subgraph that is producing high query fees versus its total signal. And so, we're working on what's going to be the best mechanics for that, keeping in mind the overall health of the network and how the gameplay goes out for that. So there's been a lot of discussion on that, and that's something that I'm really pushing forward, because I'm all about creating a fun playing field for everyone, but also for myself. This is something that I enjoy doing, and I love being compensated when we do good work. So.
Well, I really appreciate GraphGod and Derek, you taking the time to join me today. I'd love to get your perspectives as curators for your long-term vision of the graph. And so what is your long-term vision for the graph?
Yeah, so the graph is solving a data problem that exists in Web3. And Chris Wessel has mentioned on one of the earlier GRT IQ podcast episodes how, once layer 2 is being incorporated, as well as Ethereum 2 and all the different changes to that block, to how the blockchain will look there, as well as all of the other blockchains. These are all different data sets that are storing information in ways that are not intended to be queried rapidly, or they're not built to be queried rapidly. And so, my long-term vision is that we're providing really the resource for looking at any historical data on the blockchain and obtaining it quickly in a way where the user doesn't even think twice about it, because there's, it's being presented so quickly. So I see it as being, kind of a core piece of really any DApp that has a need for historical information, which is essentially everyone. Everyone needs data, and that's what we provide. And that's why the graph is just in an incredibly great position for Web3.
I've mentioned earlier in the podcast about how I see basically the web moving over to the blockchain, with tools like IPFS and all that. And, like Derek said, without a doubt, we have a data problem. And one of the greatest ways that I've heard the graph described was in a tweet by Ava Balin. She said that the graph is a decentralized data market. And that's just it. Like Derek said, there's a ton of information that's going to be needed. Just to put it into context, I believe that the Sushi Swap analytics page makes something like 70 requests to the graph on one page just to provide all the information that's needed on that one page. So clearly there is a need for an enormous amount of data and to be able to access that information quickly. That's only one example. And of course, DeFi is fairly complicated, but there's plenty of other applications which typically require access to terabytes worth of data quickly. I mean, if you think about something like Facebook or Twitter, how much information they likely process every fraction of a second is probably, is more than you could read manually in maybe your entire lifetime. So, we have this problem, and Graph is the solution. Not only is it the solution, it's the first solution. And so it has an excellent position going forward, being the first mover, and having that advantage. So, the vision is every site, every service that needs information is eventually going to use the graph for it.
GraphGod, Derek, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. This has been so, informative, and I love speaking to people that have been early in the community and created so much value, like you two and everyone else collaborating at the Curation Station. So for those that want to follow your work, Derek, you mentioned you've made some videos and very helpful how-tos for people that want to participate. in the community, what's the best way to follow your guys' work and stay in touch?
Yeah, so I can be followed on Twitter as data_nexus. But probably the best way to reach out to me, which I definitely welcome to anyone who has questions on curation, is jump into the Graph Discord, jump into the Curation Station, and then just message at DataNexus, and I'll be there. So yeah, Twitter and then Curation Station. That's the best ways.
You can reach me on Twitter at GraphGod1. And as Derek mentioned, I'm also somewhat available on the Graph Discord, but most likely you'll find me on the Curation Station Telegram. And by the time this podcast releases, we'll have our website up in some fashion, at least, so that you can click on links to join the Telegram and the Discord channels. And you can find us at grt.fyi.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRT IQ Podcast. Roger that.